Eleanor Matthews froze mid-step on her front porch, her weathered hand gripping the wooden railing as 10,000 people filled her Montana ranch. News helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their cameras focused on the massive grave where Alpha lay beneath fresh Montana soil. This wasn't supposed to be a media circus. FBI agent Sarah Blackfoot stumbled backward, her radio crackling with urgent chatter as reporters surged toward the makeshift podium. Vincent Coleman sat handcuffed in the patrol car, tears streaming down his scarred face as he watched the woman he'd tormented for 15 years command the world's attention. Eleanor's trembling fingers touched the small wooden cross marking her wolf's resting place, remembering the tiny cub she'd found in a cardboard box 15 years ago. Now the entire nation wanted to know her story. "Ma'am, you need to speak now," Agent Blackfoot whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the crowd's murmur. What had started as a simple funeral for a beloved pet had become something far more powerful. Could one old woman's love story really change how America saw wild things? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 15 years earlier, Eleanor Matthews had been a different woman entirely. At 72, she moved through her empty ranch house like a ghost haunting her own life, setting two place settings for breakfast every morning, though only one would ever be touched. Robert's coffee mug sat in its exact spot on the kitchen counter, a shrine to 47 years of shared conversations that would never come again. The silence was what got to her most. After decades of Robert's morning whistling and their gentle banter over scrambled eggs, the quiet felt like a living thing pressing against her chest. She'd catch herself starting sentences with, "Robert, did you see?" only to remember that Robert would never see anything again. The medical bills from his final months still arrived weekly, cruel reminders that grief came with a price tag of $8,400 in unpaid expenses. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," Eleanor muttered to herself, a habit she'd developed to fill the overwhelming silence. Her daughter Sarah called every Sunday from Seattle, voice bright with forced cheer as she repeated the same invitation. "Mom, just pack a bag and come stay with us. The guest room has a beautiful view of the Sound." But Eleanor couldn't leave. This 40-acre ranch bordering Glacier National Park wasn't just her home. It was the last place she'd been truly happy. Every creaking floorboard held memories of Robert's heavy work boots. Every window frame still bore the marks where he'd measured Sarah's height each birthday. To leave would be to abandon the only version of herself that had ever mattered. The financial reality was harsh as winter wind. Social Security provided $1,247 monthly, barely enough to cover property taxes, utilities, and the simplest groceries. She'd already sold Robert's tools, his hunting rifles, even his father's pocket watch. The kitchen table was covered with bills she shuffled like tarot cards, hoping to divine some solution to her mounting debt. Eleanor had been the town's beloved school nurse for 38 years, patching scraped knees and soothing fevered foreheads with the same gentle efficiency she'd used to care for Robert during his illness. Former students like Marcus Redcloud, now the local forest ranger, still stopped by to check on her and fix whatever was broken around the house. His visits were kind but tinged with sadness. His own wife had died in a wolf attack 3 years prior, leaving him understanding grief in ways Eleanor wished he didn't. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a town of barely 3,000 souls, she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. Neighbors waved politely but kept their distance, as if widowhood were contagious. At the grocery store, young mothers pulled their children closer when she passed, and cashiers looked through her like she was made of air. "Bless your heart," she'd whisper to her reflection each night, using the Southern phrase her own grandmother had taught her, words that could mean sympathy or gentle mockery, depending on the speaker's intent. These days, Eleanor wasn't sure which she meant. The thunderstorm hit Millbrook like God's own temper tantrum, rattling Eleanor's windows and cutting power lines across half the county. At 2:30 in the morning on March 15th, she sat in her rocking chair by the kitchen window, watching lightning illuminate the ranch in stark, ghostly snapshots. Robert used to say storms made him feel alive, all that raw power reminding folks how small they really were in the grand scheme of things. She was thinking about making chamomile tea when she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it beneath the thunder's rolling growl. A whimpering, desperate and weak, coming from somewhere near her front porch. Eleanor grabbed Robert's old flashlight and wrapped her quilted robe tighter around her shoulders. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," she breathed, stepping onto the covered porch. There, tucked against her front door like an abandoned package, sat a cardboard box that definitely hadn't been there when she'd locked up for the night. The whimpering grew louder as she approached, and her flashlight beam revealed 4 tiny, dark shapes huddled together for warmth. Puppies, or at least that's what she thought they were. 4 little bodies no bigger than hamsters, eyes barely open, soaked from the storm despite the box's meager protection. Their fur was darker than any puppy she'd ever seen, almost black with gray markings, and they shivered so violently she could hear their tiny teeth chattering. A folded piece of paper was tucked beneath them, and Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the rain-smudged words. "Their mother was shot. You're their only hope. A friend." Her heart clenched like a fist. Shot. Someone had killed these babies' mother and left them to die in a storm. The cruelty of it made her stomach turn, but the helplessness in their tiny cries called to something deeper, the same instinct that had made her spend 38 years patching up scraped children and nursing sick students back to health. Eleanor scooped up the box and hurried inside, her mind already racing through everything she knew about caring for newborn animals. The kitchen was still warm from the wood stove, and she set the box on the table under her brightest lamp. The puppies, she refused to think of them as anything else, were hypothermic, their breathing shallow and rapid. "Robert always said I had too much heart for my own good," she whispered, reaching for the towels in her linen closet. "Eleanor," he'd say, "you'd adopt a rattlesnake if it looked lonely." "Well, I didn't adopt rattlesnakes. I adopted—" She paused, studying their unusual features more closely. These weren't quite like any puppies she'd seen before, but 4 babies needed her, and that was enough. And she warmed towels in the dryer and created a makeshift nest beside the stove, then gently lifted each tiny body from the box. They were so small, so fragile, their hearts beating like hummingbird wings against her palms. The largest one, a male with distinctive white markings on his chest, opened dark eyes and looked directly at her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "Hello there, little man," Eleanor cooed, feeling something shift in her chest, the first spark of genuine joy she'd experienced since Robert's funeral. "You're going to be Alpha, aren't you?" "Yes, you are." The name came naturally, as if the puppy had whispered it himself. The others followed quickly. Scout for the female who kept trying to explore despite her weakness, Storm for the gray male who'd arrived with the tempest, and Grace for the smallest female whose gentle nature was already apparent. As Eleanor warmed goat's milk and fed them with an eyedropper, she felt purpose returning to her life like blood flowing back into a sleeping limb. She should call animal control. She knew that. But as she watched Alpha curl against her palm, his tiny tail wagging weakly as he took nourishment, Eleanor made a decision that would change everything. These babies had already lost their mother. They wouldn't lose their chance at life, too. "Promise me you'll find something to live for," Robert had whispered during his final days, his hand weak but insistent in hers. At the time, she'd thought he was asking the impossible. How do you find meaning when your heart has been carved hollow? But as four orphaned creatures settled into sleep against her warmth, Eleanor understood that sometimes life's greatest gifts arrived in the most unexpected packages. The storm raged outside, but inside her kitchen, Eleanor Matthews had found her reason to keep breathing. She just had no idea that her act of mercy would eventually place her at the center of a battle that would captivate the entire nation and force everyone to question what family really meant. Outside, lightning continued to flash, and somewhere in the darkness, eyes watched her house with keen interest. By August, Eleanor's puppies had grown into something that made the mailman nervous and sent the neighbor's beagle into hysterics every time they appeared in the yard. At 30 pounds each, Alpha, Scout, Storm, and Grace possessed an otherworldly beauty that didn't quite match any dog breed Eleanor could identify. Their legs were longer than she'd expected, their snouts more pointed, and their eyes held an intelligence that sometimes made her feel like they were the ones studying her. The first real sign of trouble came when Mrs. Henderson from down the road stopped by with a casserole and curiosity. Eleanor had been teaching Alpha to sit when her neighbor's cheerful chatter died mid-sentence. "Eleanor, honey," Mrs. Henderson said carefully, her eyes fixed on Alpha's powerful frame. "What exactly kind of dogs are these?" "Mixed breed," Eleanor replied quickly, though doubt had been gnawing at her for weeks. "The vet says they're part German Shepherd, part something else." But she hadn't actually taken them to a vet. Every time she'd called Dr. Morrison's office, something had held her back. An instinct that said bringing these particular animals to official attention might not end well for any of them. That instinct proved correct when Scout injured her paw on a piece of broken fence. With no other choice, Eleanor called the only veterinarian she trusted, Dr. Rebecca Whitehorse, a young woman who'd set up practice just outside town and had a reputation for asking fewer questions than most. Dr. Whitehorse arrived at sunset, her medical bag in one hand and a concerned expression on her face. She took one look at Scout and went very still. "Eleanor," she said quietly, kneeling beside the injured animal, "these aren't dogs." The words hung in the kitchen air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. Eleanor felt her knees go weak, and she gripped the back of her chair for support. "What do you mean they're not dogs?" Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "Of course they're dogs. Someone left them on my porch as puppies." Dr. Whitehorse gently examined Scout's paw while the other three animals watched with alert intelligence. "Eleanor, these are wolves, gray wolves to be specific. And not just any wolves. These have veterinary markings that suggest they came from a research facility." The kitchen seemed to tilt sideways. Eleanor sank into her chair, watching Alpha pad over to rest his massive head on her lap in that gentle way he'd done since he was small enough to fit in her palm. "Wolves," she whispered. "I've been raising wolves." "For 6 months, by the look of them. Which means you've committed a federal crime. Possession of protected wildlife without permits carries a $50,000 fine and possible jail time." Dr. Whitehorse's voice was gentle but firm. "Eleanor, I need to report this. Please." The word escaped Eleanor's throat like a prayer. "Please don't take them away from me." She looked around her kitchen. At Alpha's food bowl beside the stove, Scout's favorite blanket in the corner, Storm's collection of sticks by the back door, Grace's tendency to curl up on Robert's old chair. For 6 months, these animals had been her reason to get up every morning, her companions through the lonely evenings, her family when she'd thought she'd never have one again. "Dr. Whitehorse, I've buried a husband, raised a daughter, and outlived most of my friends. But these wolves, they taught me how to live again. I don't care if it's legal. I care if it's right." Dr. Whitehorse studied Eleanor's face for a long moment, then looked at the 4 wolves who sat calmly around their human mother, showing none of the aggression or fear that wild animals should display. Scout hadn't even flinched during her examination. "There's something else," Dr. Whitehorse said finally. "These markings on their ears, they're from a specific research facility that was shut down 2 years ago for illegal breeding operations. Someone rescued these cubs and brought them to you." Before Eleanor could respond, headlights swept across her kitchen window. A white pickup truck was pulling into her driveway, and Eleanor recognized it immediately. Vincent Coleman, the wildlife removal specialist who'd been making rounds through the area lately, offering to help folks with problem animals. "Eleanor, don't answer that door," Dr. Whitehorse said urgently. "Vincent Coleman isn't what he seems. There are rumors." The knock came anyway, confident and demanding. Through the window, Eleanor could see Vincent's tall frame silhouetted against his truck's headlights. Alpha and Storm both growled low in their throats, a sound that raised every hair on Eleanor's arms. "Mrs. Matthews, it's Vincent Coleman. I heard you might have some animals that need professional relocation." Eleanor's blood went cold. She hadn't told anyone about the wolves except Dr. Whitehorse, which meant someone had been watching her house, reporting her activities. "You don't have to let him in," Dr. Whitehorse whispered. But Eleanor was already walking to the door, her mind made up. If Vincent Coleman wanted to see her wolves, he could see them, but he'd also see that they had a protector who wouldn't give them up without a fight. She opened the door to find Vincent's weathered face creased in what was probably meant to be a reassuring smile. His eyes, however, were cold and calculating as they swept past her into the kitchen, where 4 magnificent wolves sat like sentinels. "Well now," Vincent said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of satisfaction and something darker. "Looks like we have quite a situation here, don't we, Mrs. Matthews?" Eleanor straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Mr. Coleman, I don't know what you think you've found here, but these are my animals, and they're staying right where they are." Vincent's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid that's not how this works, ma'am. Those are dangerous wild animals, and I'm here to help you do the right thing." The word dangerous hung in the air as Alpha rose from his position and moved to stand beside Eleanor, his presence both protective and unmistakably wild. The 5 years following Dr. Whitehorse's revelation passed like scenes from a movie Eleanor never expected to star in. What had begun as a simple act of mercy, saving 4 orphaned cubs, had evolved into something that would test every relationship in her life and challenge everything Millbrook thought it knew about the difference between wild and tame, dangerous and protective. By 2014, Alpha, Scout, Storm, and Grace had grown into magnificent creatures that commanded both respect and fear from anyone who encountered them. Alpha stood 32 inches at the shoulder, his charcoal coat now streaked with distinguished silver around his muzzle, leading his small pack with the wisdom of a creature who understood both his wild heritage and his chosen family. Scout had developed into an elegant female with keen intelligence that seemed to anticipate Eleanor's needs before Eleanor herself knew them. Storm lived up to his name with a powerful build and protective instincts that made delivery drivers think twice about approaching the house uninvited. Grace, the smallest of the 4, possessed a gentle spirit that could calm any situation, and often served as the bridge between her more assertive siblings and the human world they'd adopted. Eleanor's ranch had become an unofficial pilgrimage site for animal lovers, researchers, and the simply curious. Cars would slow as they passed her property, drivers craning their necks for a glimpse of the Wolf Lady of Millbrook and her extraordinary family. Some days, Eleanor felt like a zoo exhibit herself, but she endured the attention because she understood what her wolves represented to people. Proof that love could transcend the boundaries humans insisted on drawing between themselves and the natural world. The legal battles had been relentless. Vincent Coleman, now revealed as the wildlife removal specialist with a personal vendetta, had orchestrated a systematic campaign to have Eleanor's wolves declared a public menace. He'd convinced 3 different county officials to file complaints, organized petitions among nervous neighbors, and even managed to get a story on the local news that portrayed Eleanor as a reckless old woman whose dangerous pets threatened the community's children. "Mrs. Matthews," the reporter had said, thrusting a microphone toward Eleanor as she worked in her garden while Alpha rested peacefully in the shade nearby, "don't you think your neighbors have a right to feel safe in their own homes?" Eleanor had straightened her aching back and looked directly into the camera. "Young man, I've lived in this community for 81 years. I've been a school nurse, a neighbor, and a friend to people who've since forgotten my name. These wolves have lived here peacefully for 5 years without harming so much as a grasshopper. If my neighbors want to feel unsafe, they're going to have to find a better reason than 4 animals who've never shown aggression toward anyone." The interview had gone viral, shared millions of times across social media platforms with hashtags like #WolfGrandma and #MontanaWolfLady. Eleanor found herself receiving letters from strangers around the world, some supportive, others threatening, all of them proof that her private life had become a public symbol for something much larger than herself. The financial strain was crushing. Legal fees had consumed Robert's life insurance policy and forced Eleanor to mortgage the ranch she'd owned free and clear for 30 years. The wolves' diet alone cost $300 a month, money she scraped together by selling Robert's coin collection, her grandmother's jewelry, and eventually her own wedding ring. Sarah called weekly from Seattle, her voice tight with frustration as she pleaded with her mother to just surrender the animals and come live with us where you'll be safe. But Eleanor couldn't make her daughter understand that safety wasn't the point anymore. Alpha, Scout, Storm, and Grace weren't pets she could abandon when things got difficult. They were family members who had chosen to stay with her when they could have easily survived in the wild. Studies had shown that captive-bred wolves often struggled to adapt to wilderness life. But Eleanor's 4 had grown large enough and smart enough to leave any time they wanted. Instead, they remained loyal to the elderly woman who'd raised them, creating a bond that defied every expert opinion about human-wolf relationships. The community remained divided. Mrs. Henderson had become Eleanor's fiercest defender after Storm had chased away a black bear that wandered too close to her grandchildren's play area. "That wolf saved my grandbabies," she'd declared at a heated town hall meeting. "Anyone who says Eleanor's animals are dangerous doesn't know what they're talking about." But others, influenced by Vincent's fear-mongering and sensational news coverage, saw the wolves as ticking time bombs. Tom Bradley, who owned the hardware store, had banned Eleanor from his establishment after she'd brought Scout with her for a routine shopping trip. "I don't care how tame you think they are," he'd said, his face red with agitation. "Wolves are predators, and predators kill. It's just a matter of time." Dr. Whitehorse had become Eleanor's closest ally during these turbulent years, providing veterinary care for the wolves and serving as an expert witness in legal proceedings. Her professional testimony about the animals' gentle temperament and excellent health had prevented several attempts to have them seized, but each legal victory felt temporary, like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. "Eleanor," Dr. Whitehorse had said during one particularly difficult period when animal control officers were threatening immediate removal, "I need you to understand what we're up against. Vincent Coleman has connections throughout the state wildlife department. He's not going to stop until he gets what he wants." But what Vincent wanted remained mysterious. His stated concern about public safety seemed genuine enough, but Eleanor sensed something deeper, more personal in his obsession with her wolves. The way his hands shook when he talked about them, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. These weren't the reactions of someone motivated purely by professional duty. The truth came in fragments, revealed through courthouse gossip and overheard conversations. Vincent had been 8 years old when his father died in Yellowstone, killed by wolves while protecting his son during a camping trip gone wrong. The trauma had shaped his entire life, driving him into a career focused on controlling the creatures he blamed for his greatest loss. Eleanor's wolves represented something he couldn't tolerate, evidence that his lifelong mission might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what wolves really were. Marcus Red Cloud, torn between his loyalty to Eleanor and his professional obligations as a forest ranger, tried to serve as a mediator between the various factions. His own guilt about bringing the cubs to Eleanor in the first place made him an unreliable ally, always looking for compromise solutions that might protect everyone involved. "Eleanor," he'd said during one of their increasingly strained conversations, "what if we could find a licensed sanctuary, somewhere professional with proper facilities and trained staff?" But Eleanor knew that somewhere professional meant somewhere without her, and that was unacceptable. These wolves had lived with her for 5 years, had learned her routines, had adapted their wild instincts to accommodate an elderly human's limitations. Separating them now would be cruel to everyone involved. As 2014 drew to a close, Eleanor felt the weight of 81 years settling into her bones. Her heart condition was worsening. Dr. Morrison had been blunt about her prognosis, and the constant stress of legal battles wasn't helping. Some nights, she lay awake listening to her wolves moving around the house, wondering what would happen to them when she was gone. Sarah had made it clear she couldn't take them, and no sanctuary would accept animals with their complex legal status. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to save 4 orphaned cubs, she'd created a situation that might doom them to destruction after her death. But every morning, when Alpha brought her slippers and Scout checked the perimeter, and Storm greeted her with gentle huffs of acknowledgement, and Grace curled up beside her chair for their daily ritual of companionship, Eleanor knew she'd made the right choice. Love wasn't supposed to be convenient or legal or approved by committees. Love was supposed to be fierce and protective and willing to sacrifice everything for the creatures that mattered most. As Vincent Coleman's campaign against her intensified and the legal noose tightened around her unconventional family, Eleanor prepared for the fight of her life, a battle that would ultimately force an entire nation to confront its assumptions about wildness, domesticity, and the true meaning of family. The storm that had brought 4 cubs to her door years earlier seemed gentle compared to the tempest that was gathering around them now. The siege began at 11:47 p.m. on December 23rd, exactly 14 years, 9 months, and 8 days after Eleanor had first opened her door to 4 tiny wolf cubs. Now, at 87, she sat in her darkened living room watching Vincent Coleman's convoy of vehicles surround her ranch like a military operation. 6 men with tranquilizer guns, animal control officers, and enough equipment to capture a pack of real wild wolves. Not 4 aging animals who spent their evenings watching television and bringing Eleanor her slippers. Alpha, now 15 years old with gray threading through his dark fur, lay beside her chair with his massive head on her lap. Scout and Storm flanked the windows, their ears alert but not aggressive, while Grace remained curled on Robert's old armchair, too arthritic to stand for long periods anymore. They knew something was wrong. Wolves always knew, but their first instinct was to protect their human mother, not themselves. Outside, news crews had arrived like vultures sensing death. Channel 7, CNN, even a crew from National Geographic had somehow learned about tonight's confrontation. Their cameras created a constellation of artificial light across Eleanor's property, turning her private nightmare into a public spectacle. The live stream counter on her granddaughter's phone showed 2.3 million viewers watching, waiting to see how this standoff would end. Eleanor's chest tightened with each breath, her heart condition protesting the stress, but she refused to show weakness. Not now. not when her family needed her to be strong. Vincent's voice crackled through the bullhorn. "Mrs. Matthews, this is your final opportunity to surrender the animals peacefully. We have a court order, federal backing, and the authority to use necessary force. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She pressed her face to the window and shouted back, her voice carrying across the cold Montana night. "Vincent Coleman, you step foot on my property and you'll find out what a pack really means. These wolves have been my family for 15 years. I'll die before I let you take them." The words carried more truth than she'd intended. Dr. Whitehorse had been clear during Eleanor's last visit. Her heart was failing. 6 months at most, maybe 8 if she was lucky. Each day had become a countdown she couldn't escape, but she'd be damned if she'd spend her final months without the only family she had left. Sarah's voice came through her phone, tearful and desperate. "Mom, please, just let them take the wolves. Come live with me in Seattle. We can be a family again." But Eleanor looked at Alpha's faithful dark eyes and knew Sarah didn't understand. This was her family. These 4 souls had pulled her back from the edge of despair when Robert died, had given her purpose when the world seemed determined to make her invisible. They weren't pets or possessions, they were her children, born not of her body, but of her heart. Vincent's team began their approach at midnight, moving in formation like they were storming a terrorist compound rather than an elderly woman's home. The first canister of tear gas shattered Eleanor's kitchen window, filling her house with acrid smoke that burned her lungs and made her cough violently. The wolves became agitated, pacing and whimpering as their sensitive noses suffered from the chemical assault. Eleanor's chest seized with pain, not from the gas, but from her failing heart. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, while Alpha immediately moved to shield her body with his own. Through the chaos, she could hear the front door splintering as Vincent's team prepared to breach. "Alpha," she whispered, gripping his thick fur, "you don't have to protect me anymore, my boy. You've done enough." But Alpha had never been just a wolf. He'd been her guardian, her companion, her son in every way that mattered. As Vincent appeared in the doorway, gun drawn and eyes wild with 35 years of accumulated rage, Alpha positioned himself between them with the dignity of a creature who understood exactly what was at stake. Vincent's hands shook as he aimed his weapon. "Move away from the animal, Mrs. Matthews. This ends tonight." Eleanor struggled to her feet, using Alpha's solid frame for support. "His name is Alpha, and he's not an animal. He's my family." "Your family?" Vincent's voice cracked with emotion. "Lady, I was 8 years old when wolves killed my father, 8 years old watching him die while protecting me. Your family are monsters." The standoff stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Cameras outside captured every moment through the broken windows, broadcasting the confrontation to millions of viewers who held their breath collectively. Save Eleanor's. Wolves began trending on social media, but hashtags couldn't stop what was about to happen. Then something extraordinary occurred. Alpha, ancient and weary but still possessing the wisdom that had made him Eleanor's protector for 15 years, began to move. Not aggressively. There was no snarl, no bared teeth, no threatening posture. Instead, he approached Vincent with the slow, careful gait of an elder offering comfort. Vincent's gun trembled. "Stay back! Don't you dare come near me!" But Alpha continued forward, and Eleanor watched in amazement as her wolf, the creature Vincent had demonized for so long, gently touched his nose to Vincent's scarred hand, the same hand that bore the marks from that terrible night in Yellowstone 35 years ago. Vincent broke. Completely and utterly broke. 35 years of rage and trauma came pouring out in great heaving sobs as he stared at this aged wolf who showed no aggression, only the infinite patience of a creature who understood pain. "Why isn't he attacking me?" Vincent whispered through his tears. "Why isn't he trying to kill me like they killed my father?" Eleanor's voice was gentle when she answered, "Because Alpha knows the difference between a frightened child and a monster. He always has." In that moment of revelation, of raw human emotion cutting through decades of misunderstanding, Vincent's gun discharged. Not intentionally. His hands were shaking too violently to control the weapon properly. The bullet ricocheted off the stone fireplace, careening toward Eleanor with deadly precision. Alpha moved without hesitation. 15 years old, arthritic, weary from a lifetime of devotion, he used the last of his strength to intercept the bullet meant for his human mother. The impact sent him crashing to the floor, and Eleanor's scream echoed across the Montana night, a sound of pure anguish that no microphone could properly capture, but every heart could feel. She crawled to Alpha, gathering his massive head in her lap as blood seeped through his dark fur. His breathing was labored, but his eyes found hers with the same love and loyalty they'd held since he was a 6-week-old cub shivering in a cardboard box. "My boy, my sweet boy," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You saved me again, didn't you? You saved me one last time." Alpha's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement. In his fading gaze, Eleanor saw 15 years of unconditional love, of morning greetings and evening companionship, of protection offered freely and without reservation. His final breath steamed in the cold Montana air, and with it, a piece of Eleanor's soul departed forever. The silence that followed was profound. Vincent had collapsed to his knees, his weapon forgotten, sobbing for the father he'd lost and the innocence that had died with him. The news crews outside had gone quiet, their cameras capturing a moment too sacred for commentary. Even Scout, Storm, and Grace seemed to understand that something irreplaceable had just ended. Vincent's voice was broken when he finally spoke. "I called the ambulance. I called them as soon as I realized. God help me, I never meant for this to happen." Eleanor looked up at him, this man who had terrorized her for years, and saw not a monster but a wounded child who had been carrying unbearable pain for far too long. "I know," she said simply. "Alpha knew too. That's why he didn't hate you." As sirens wailed in the distance and the world watched through their screens, Eleanor Matthews sat on her living room floor, holding the body of the creature who had saved her life in every way possible. Outside, hashtags multiplied and debates raged, but none of it mattered now. Alpha was gone, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence after Alpha's final breath was the most terrible sound Eleanor had ever heard. It pressed against her eardrums like deep water, drowning out the sirens approaching from town, the murmur of news crews outside, even her own ragged breathing. In that crushing quiet, she understood that some losses are so profound they actually change the physics of the world, the way light falls, the way air moves, the way a heart beats in a chest that suddenly feels too empty to sustain life. Alpha's body was still warm in her lap, his massive head heavy against her trembling hands. For 15 years, this magnificent creature had been her anchor to hope, her reason to wake each morning, her family when the human world had forgotten she existed. Now he was gone, and Eleanor felt herself fragmenting like glass struck by a hammer, too many pieces to ever fit back together properly. Vincent knelt 10 feet away, his own tears mixing with hers on the blood-stained floor. The man who had hunted her for years, who had made her life a living hell with his obsession, now looked exactly like what he'd always been, a terrified 8-year-old boy who had never stopped running from the night his father died. His transformation from tormentor to fellow mourner would have been touching if Eleanor could feel anything beyond the crushing weight of grief. "Mrs. Matthews," he whispered, his voice broken and small, "I am so sorry. I never wanted this to happen." Eleanor didn't look up from Alpha's face. Even in death, her wolf's expression held peace, the serene dignity of a creature who had lived with purpose and died protecting what he loved most. "He forgave you," she said quietly. "Before you even asked for it, Alpha forgave you. That's what real love does, Vincent. It doesn't keep score." The paramedics arrived first, their boots heavy on her front porch, but they stopped short when they saw the scene inside. This wasn't a medical emergency, it was a wake. Eleanor sat in the center of her living room, surrounded by Scout, Storm, and Grace, who had formed a protective circle around their fallen pack leader. The three surviving wolves showed no aggression toward the humans filling their home, only a profound sadness that seemed to emanate from their very bones. Dr. Whitehorse pushed through the crowd of officials, her medical bag forgotten as she knelt beside Eleanor. "Oh, honey," she breathed, her own eyes filling with tears as she took in the scene. "I'm so sorry." 15 years, Eleanor whispered, her fingers threading through Alpha's cooling fur. 15 years he protected me, fed him from a bottle when he was no bigger than my hand, and he grew up to take a bullet meant for me. Her voice cracked on the last words, and the sound of her breaking heart seemed to echo through the house. Outside, the crowd had grown to impossible proportions. What had started as a law enforcement operation had become something unprecedented, a vigil that was spreading across social media faster than wildfire. #AlphaHero was trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing the live-streamed footage of an elderly woman holding her dying wolf, of a creature choosing love over survival in its final moments. Eleanor's phone, forgotten on the coffee table, buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, documentary filmmakers, and strangers who had been moved by what they'd witnessed. The video of Alpha approaching Vincent with gentleness instead of aggression had already been viewed 47 million times, shared with captions in dozens of languages, dissected by animal behavior experts who struggled to explain what they'd seen. Sarah arrived from Seattle just after midnight, having chartered a private flight the moment she'd seen the news coverage. She burst through the front door like a force of nature, pushing past police officers and camera crews until she found her mother still sitting on the floor, still holding Alpha's head in her lap. "Mom," Sarah sobbed, dropping to her knees beside Eleanor. For the first time in years, she didn't mention the wolves being dangerous or Eleanor being foolish. She simply wrapped her arms around her mother and held her while they both grieved for the creature who had been family. "I was wrong," Sarah whispered against Eleanor's shoulder. "I was so wrong about all of this. About Alpha, about what family means, about you. Can you ever forgive me?" Eleanor finally looked up from Alpha's peaceful face, and Sarah was shocked by what she saw. Her mother's eyes held a depth of sorrow that seemed bottomless. But beneath the grief was something else, a fierce, unshakable love that death itself couldn't diminish. "There's nothing to forgive, sweetheart," Eleanor said softly. "You were just trying to protect me, just like Alpha was." The house filled with an odd collection of mourners as the night wore on. Vincent sat in the corner, his hatred dissolved into something resembling peace. Dr. Whitehorse stayed close, offering what comfort she could to both Eleanor and the three surviving wolves. Marcus Red Cloud arrived with tears streaming down his weathered face, this tough forest ranger reduced to sobs by the loss of an animal he'd helped Eleanor hide for years. "That wolf saved my life once," Marcus told the gathering, his voice thick with emotion. 3 years ago, when I was tracking that injured bear up on Fletcher Ridge. Got myself turned around in a snowstorm, half frozen and lost. Alpha found me, led me right back to the main trail. Never said a word to Eleanor about it, figured she had enough to worry about. But that wolf, he knew I was family too. The stories began flowing then, each person sharing their own encounter with Alpha and his pack. Mrs. Henderson from down the road admitted that Alpha had once chased off a black bear that was getting too close to her grandchildren's play area. Jim from the hardware store revealed that Storm regularly walked him home when he worked late, as if understanding that a 70-year-old man shouldn't be walking alone in the dark. Even the mailman, Pete, confessed that Scout had become his daily companion on his route, trotting alongside his truck like a faithful guardian. They weren't just Mrs. Matthews' wolves, Pete said wonderingly. They were the whole town's wolves. We just never realized it. As dawn approached, Eleanor finally allowed Dr. Whitehorse to help her move Alpha's body to a more dignified position. They wrapped him in Eleanor's finest quilt, the one her grandmother had made with tiny stitches that had taken 2 years to complete. It seemed fitting that Alpha should rest in something made with such love and patience. The 3 surviving wolves, Scout, Storm, and Grace, each approached their fallen leader one final time. They sniffed him gently, touched their noses to his still form, and then retreated to Eleanor's side with the understanding that their pack structure had forever changed. Grace, the smallest and gentlest, curled up against Eleanor's leg and refused to move, as if she understood that their human mother needed protection now more than ever. Eleanor looked around her crowded living room, at Vincent weeping in the corner, at Sarah holding her hand, at the townspeople who had come to pay their respects to a creature they'd once feared. Through her broken front window, she could see the crowd outside holding candles, their faces solemn in the flickering light. "He brought us all together," she said wonderingly. "Even in dying, Alpha brought us together." But the weight of his loss was crushing. Eleanor had survived her husband's death, had endured years of loneliness and financial struggle, had faced down government officials and hostile neighbors. But this, losing the creature who had saved her soul when she'd thought it was beyond redemption, felt like more than her heart could bear. As the sun rose over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that Alpha would never see again, Eleanor Matthews understood that her own story was nearing its end. Without her faithful guardian, without his gentle strength to lean on, she felt herself beginning the slow slide toward whatever came next. The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen to the Wolf Lady of Millbrook. But Eleanor only cared about one thing, honoring the memory of the creature who had loved her unconditionally for 15 precious years, and finding the strength to protect the 3 wolves who still needed her, even as her own light began to dim. 3 days after Alpha's death, when Eleanor's house had finally emptied of officials and mourners, Marcus Red Cloud appeared at her kitchen door with the weight of 15 years pressing on his shoulders. His usually steady hands trembled as he removed his forest ranger hat, and Eleanor knew immediately that whatever he'd come to say would change everything she thought she understood about her wolves. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about those cubs, something I should have told you years ago." She was sitting at her kitchen table, the same spot where she'd first fed Alpha from an eyedropper, surrounded by sympathy cards from strangers who had been moved by his story. Scout lay at her feet, unwilling to leave her side since the tragedy, while Storm and Grace maintained their vigil by the front window, still watching for their fallen leader. "Marcus, honey, if this is about blame—" "It's not about blame," he interrupted, sinking into Robert's old chair across from her. "It's about the truth. Eleanor, those cubs weren't orphaned by accident. They were rescued." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Eleanor felt her world tilt slightly. The same sensation she'd experienced when Dr. Whitehorse had first told her they were wolves, not dogs. Marcus pulled a manila folder from inside his jacket, his hand shaking as he placed it on the table between them. The documents inside bore official letterheads: FBI, Fish and Wildlife Service, Montana State Police. Eleanor's name appeared on several pages, along with photographs that made her gasp. March 14th, 2009, Marcus began, his voice thick with guilt. The night before you found those cubs, there was a federal raid on an illegal wildlife breeding facility about 60 miles from here. Vincent Coleman's operation. Eleanor's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. Scout immediately moved to clean up the mess, a habit Alpha had taught all of them when they were young. The sight of the wolf's careful attention to her well-being nearly broke Eleanor's composure entirely. Vincent was breeding wolves for the exotic pet trade, Marcus continued. Rich people who wanted wild animals as status symbols, private zoos, research facilities that weren't too particular about where their subjects came from. The FBI had been tracking him for 2 years. But you said their mother was shot. She was. When Vincent realized the raid was coming, he tried to destroy the evidence. Started shooting the adult animals rather than let them be traced back to him. I was part of the task force, Eleanor. I watched him kill 12 wolves that night, including the mother of 4 6-week-old cubs. Eleanor's chest tightened with familiar pain, but this was different from her heart condition. This was the agony of understanding that Alpha's entire existence had been built on trauma she'd never known about. I couldn't let him kill the babies, too, Marcus whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. While the other agents were processing the scene, I took the cubs, drove them to the one person I knew would love them unconditionally, no questions asked. I left them on your porch because I was a coward, Eleanor. I couldn't face telling you the truth. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle sounds of Storm and Grace shifting by the window. Eleanor stared at the documents, seeing her wolves' lives laid out in cold, clinical language that could never capture what they'd meant to her. So Alpha and his siblings, they weren't wild-born? No? They were second-generation captive-bred. That's why they bonded so easily with you, why they never showed aggression toward humans. They were genetically programmed to be companions, Eleanor. Vincent's operation specialized in creating wolves that could live with people. A terrible understanding began to dawn. Vincent has been looking for them all these years. Not because he hated wolves in general, but because they were his property, worth $50,000 each on the black market, and more than that, they were evidence of his crimes. As long as they existed, as long as someone could prove they came from his facility through DNA testing, Vincent could never be truly safe from prosecution. Eleanor felt the pieces clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Vincent's obsession with her wolves hadn't been about childhood trauma, it had been about covering up his crimes. The man who had terrorized her for 15 years, who had ultimately caused Alpha's death, had been the same monster who had killed their mother. "The FBI knew about this?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. Marcus nodded miserably. Agent Sarah Blackfoot has been building a case against Vincent for years. They've been watching him, gathering evidence, but they needed proof of his breeding operation. Your wolves were that proof, Eleanor. Living, breathing evidence of federal wildlife trafficking crimes. "They've been using me," Eleanor said, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Using Alpha and Scout and Storm and Grace. We were all just bait in some federal investigation." "No," Marcus said urgently. "It wasn't like that. Agent Blackfoot wanted to contact you directly, wanted to bring you into protective custody. But the Department of Justice was afraid that moving the wolves would tip off Vincent, make him run before they could arrest him. They thought, we all thought, that keeping you in the dark was keeping you safe." Eleanor stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. The 3 surviving wolves immediately came to attention, sensing her distress. For 15 years, she had believed she was protecting orphaned creatures from a cruel world. Now she discovered that the world had been using her wolves as pawns in a game she'd never known she was playing. "Alpha died protecting evidence," she said flatly. "Not protecting me. not protecting his family. He died protecting a federal investigation. Eleanor, no, that's not— Get out! Her voice was quiet but carried the force of absolute authority. Get out of my house, Marcus. Get out, and don't come back. Marcus stood slowly, his face crumpled with grief and guilt. Eleanor, please, I know you're angry, but— Angry? Eleanor turned to face him, and Marcus stepped back at the expression in her eyes. Angry doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling right now. You let me believe I was saving innocent babies. You let me love them and bond with them and build my entire life around them, all while knowing they were evidence in some investigation. You let Vincent terrorize me for years when you could have stopped it with a single phone call. We couldn't risk compromising the case. Compromising the case? Eleanor's voice rose to a shout. Alpha is dead, Marcus. My boy is dead because you and your federal friends decided that catching Vincent was more important than protecting the creatures he'd already traumatized. You used me and you used them, and now Alpha has paid the price for your games. Scout whimpered and pressed against Eleanor's legs, trying to comfort the human who had comforted her for so many years. The gesture broke something inside Eleanor, and she sank back into her chair, suddenly feeling every one of her 87 years. There's more, Marcus said quietly. Agent Blackfoot is outside. She wants to talk to you. Eleanor looked through her kitchen window and saw a woman in a dark suit standing beside an unmarked sedan. Even from a distance, she could see the agent's professional composure warring with what looked like genuine remorse. She can want all she likes, Eleanor said coldly. I'm done being anyone's unwitting accomplice. But even as she spoke, Eleanor knew she would have to face the truth eventually. Alpha's death had made headlines around the world, and the FBI couldn't keep their investigation secret much longer. Vincent was in custody, but the legal proceedings would require her testimony, would require her to relive every moment of the past 15 years while lawyers dissected her relationship with the wolves she'd loved. Eleanor, Marcus said from the doorway, his hand on the frame like he was steadying himself. For what it's worth, I've watched you with those wolves for 15 years. What you gave them, what they gave you, that was real. That was love, not evidence. Don't let the truth about how they came to you destroy what you built together. After he left, Eleanor sat in her kitchen surrounded by the ghosts of her life. Robert's empty chair, Alpha's food bowl still sitting by the stove, the scattered sympathy cards from strangers who understood loss. Through the window, she could see Agent Blackfoot still waiting, patient as a hunter. The 3 surviving wolves settled around Eleanor's chair, their warm bodies pressed against her legs in a formation they'd learned from Alpha. Protection without aggression, comfort without demand. They didn't know about federal investigations or black market breeding operations. They only knew that their human mother was in pain, and their job was to make it better. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to reconcile the 2 versions of her story, the one where she was a lonely widow who had found purpose in saving orphaned wolves, and the one where she was an unwitting federal informant whose love had been manipulated by people who saw her wolves as evidence rather than family. Both stories were true. Both stories were heartbreaking, and somewhere between them lay the path forward, if she could find the strength to walk it. Outside, Agent Blackfoot continued to wait, carrying the weight of 15 years of secrets, and the hope that Eleanor Matthews might somehow find it in her heart to forgive them all. 6 months after Alpha's funeral, Eleanor Matthews stood before a crowd of 10,000 people gathered on her ranch, watching the sun set over the Montana mountains that had witnessed both tragedy and transformation. The wooden podium felt sturdy beneath her hands, but her heart hammered against her ribs with the knowledge that the words she spoke today would either heal the wounds of the past 15 years or tear them open forever. Agent Sarah Blackfoot had been right about one thing. The truth about Vincent's breeding operation had brought justice. Vincent Coleman was now serving 25 years in federal prison for wildlife trafficking, racketeering, and a dozen other charges that the FBI had been building against him for over a decade. His entire network had collapsed like a house of cards, freeing hundreds of illegally bred animals and shutting down operations across 3 states. But justice had come at a price that still took Eleanor's breath away. The crowd before her represented something unprecedented in American conservation history. Politicians sat beside ranchers, federal agents next to animal rights activists, all united by the story of an elderly woman and the wolves who had taught an entire nation what family really meant. The GoFundMe campaign that had started spontaneously during Alpha's death had raised $2.3 million, enough to establish the sanctuary Eleanor had never dreamed possible. 15 years ago, Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the gathering, I thought I was saving 4 orphaned wolf cubs. What I discovered was that they were saving me. She paused, looking out at faces that had become familiar over the months of legal proceedings and media attention. Sarah sat in the front row, having moved back to Montana permanently to help run the sanctuary. Dr. Whitehorse was there with her veterinary team, now the official medical staff for what would become the largest wolf sanctuary in the Northwest. Even Marcus Red Cloud had come, though the guilt he carried still etched deep lines around his eyes. People ask me if I'm angry about being deceived, Eleanor continued. If I feel betrayed by the people who used my love for these animals to further their investigation. And I'll be honest with you, there were dark nights when anger was all that kept me breathing. Scout, Storm, and Grace lay in the shade beside the podium, their graying muzzles testament to the years they'd spent as Eleanor's companions. At 14 years old, they moved more slowly now, but their eyes still held the intelligence and gentleness that had made them perfect ambassadors for their misunderstood species. But then I remember Alpha's last moments, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. I remember him choosing love over fear, protection over self-preservation, and I realized that being angry about how our story began would dishonor everything we built together. The crowd was absolutely silent, even the news crews seeming to hold their breath. Eleanor had refused all interviews for months, letting lawyers and federal agents tell the legal story while she grieved in private. This was her first public statement since the night Alpha died, and everyone understood they were witnessing something historic. Vincent Coleman spent 35 years letting trauma turn him into someone he never meant to be, Eleanor continued. He let one terrible night in his childhood define every decision he made afterward. I won't make that mistake. I won't let the pain of these revelations overshadow the joy of 15 years spent loving creatures who loved me back without reservation. Vincent himself had written to Eleanor from prison, a letter that had taken him 6 months to compose and her 2 weeks to read. In shaky handwriting, he had confessed everything, the breeding operation that had started as legitimate research and slowly corrupted into something monstrous, the mounting desperation as federal investigators closed in, the way his childhood trauma had twisted into an obsession with controlling the creatures he feared most. I made those wolves to be weapons, he had written, gentle enough to live with humans, strong enough to command respect. I thought I was creating the perfect predator. Instead, I created the perfect teachers. Alpha taught me something in those final moments that 30 years of therapy couldn't. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing not to let the past choose your future. Eleanor had visited him once, bringing a photograph of Alpha's grave that now served as the centerpiece of the sanctuary. Vincent had wept when he saw it, and for the first time in their twisted relationship, Eleanor had seen not her tormentor, but a broken man trying to piece himself back together. Today, we dedicate Alpha's place, Eleanor announced, gesturing toward the sprawling facility that had risen from the donations of strangers moved by their story. A sanctuary for wolves who, like Alpha and his siblings, find themselves caught between the wild world they were born into and the human world that shaped them. The sanctuary was everything Eleanor had never dared to dream. Professional-grade enclosures that gave the wolves room to run while keeping them safe from those who still saw them as threats. A veterinary clinic that would serve as a research center for ethical wolf conservation. Educational programs designed to change minds one visitor at a time. But the most important feature was Alpha's memorial garden, where his grave was marked by a simple stone bearing the words, "He chose love." Around it, benches provided quiet spaces for reflection, and a fountain created the sound of running water that wolves loved so much. "Some people have asked why I'm not keeping Alpha's place as a private sanctuary," Eleanor said. "Why open it to the public when I could just live quietly with Scout, Storm, and Grace for whatever time we have left?" Dr. Whitehorse had been honest about Eleanor's prognosis. The stress of the past year had accelerated her heart condition, and she had perhaps 2 years if she was careful, maybe less if she wasn't. But Eleanor had made her peace with mortality the night she'd held Alpha as he died. "The answer is simple," she continued. "Alpha didn't die just to protect me. He died to protect the idea that love transcends species, that family isn't about blood or DNA, but about choice and commitment and showing up for each other when it matters most." A young voice called out from the crowd, "Mrs. Matthews, what do you want people to remember about Alpha?" Eleanor smiled, recognizing the girl as one of the local children who had started volunteering at the sanctuary. "I want them to remember that he was proof that even creatures bred for human purposes can choose their own path. Alpha could have been wild. He could have been aggressive. He could have left when he got big enough to survive on his own. Instead, he chose to stay with a lonely old woman who needed him more than she ever knew how to say." As the ceremony continued, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion settling over her. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she'd first opened her door to 4 shivering cubs, but it was the ending their story deserved. Alpha's legacy would live on in every wolf that found safety at the sanctuary, in every visitor who left with a changed perspective on what it meant to share the world with wild things. The sun touched the horizon as Eleanor spoke her final words. "Alpha taught me that love isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. It's about showing up every day, especially the hard days, and choosing to care for something beyond yourself. That's what family means. That's what pack means. And that's what we're committing to here today. Not just for the wolves, but for each other." As darkness fell over the Montana mountains, lights came on throughout the sanctuary, illuminating the paths where wolves would walk safely for generations to come. Eleanor sat on the porch of her house, now the sanctuary's headquarters, with Scout, Storm, and Grace arranged around her feet in the formation Alpha had taught them so many years ago. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, one of the new residents calling to the pack they'd never had. The 3 old wolves at Eleanor's feet lifted their heads and answered, their voices joining in a song that spoke of loss and hope, of endings and beginnings, of love that outlasts everything that tries to destroy it. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to the harmony, knowing that Alpha would have loved this moment more than any of them. His pack had grown beyond anything they'd ever imagined, and his legacy would echo through these mountains long after the last person who remembered his name had gone to join him. The Wolf Lady of Millbrook had finally come home. Eleanor's story reminds us that sometimes our greatest purpose finds us when we think life has nothing left to offer. At 72, widowed and forgotten by a world that treats aging like invisibility, she could have surrendered to loneliness. Instead, 4 tiny lives showed her that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up day after day with unconditional love. Like so many of us in our golden years, Eleanor discovered that when society writes us off as past our prime, we're actually entering our most meaningful chapter. Her wolves didn't see an elderly woman. They saw their protector, their provider, their pack leader. Alpha's sacrifice wasn't just about protecting Eleanor, it was about honoring 15 years of mutual devotion that proved love transcends every boundary we think exists. For those of us who've buried spouses, watched children move away, or felt society's indifference, Eleanor's journey offers profound hope. Our capacity to love and be loved doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. Sometimes the family we need most arrives unexpectedly, teaching us that purpose isn't about what we've lost, but what we choose to nurture. What unexpected family has brought meaning to your later years? Have you ever found purpose in an unlikely place when you thought your meaningful chapters were behind you? Share your story below. We'd love to hear how life surprised you with new beginnings.